Today, I'll give you a placement strategy you can apply to every single Settlers of Catan game. I'm Treeckosaurus, I'm a Catan Universe Grandmaster and a 3x Catan tournament finalist. And in this video you'll learn everything I know about the hybrid or we cheap strategy, which is widely considered to be the strongest strategy in the game. So let's get started by answering the question, what is hybrid or we cheap? Or we cheap is a strategy which focuses on getting cities and development cards efficiently by placing on high ore, wheat and sheep spots. There are two variations, full or we cheap and hybrid or we cheap. Full or we cheap places its first two settlements on only ore, wheat and sheep, while hybrid or we cheap also has a little bit of wood or brick. It's difficult for both strategies to build roads and settlements, but especially for full or we cheap, it's really tough. The biggest strength of full or we cheap is its ability to get largest army consistently. Hybrid or we cheap is more flexible, as it also has the ability to get longest road in some games, but its main focus is getting largest army as well. Let's have a look at the first of 3 consecutive Catan Universe matches I played. In these matches I forced myself to play with or we cheap strategies. Okay. On the screen we see the first board, and my minimum production rules for ore and wheat while playing ore with sheep are 4 points of production, while the minimum for sheep is 3 points of production. And as you can see, there's not a lot of ore on this board. In fact, only one player can place on a free hex spot with a minimum of 4 ore production points, which makes the 693 or the 692 really interesting. There are a lot of strong wheat sheep spots on this board. It's really important to check how many ore wheat or sheep and wheat sheep spots a board has, because it gives you insight in how the placements go down. If there are strong ore wheat spots on the board, they are often picked by one of the first 2 players. With the sand tile in the outer ring and very many wheat sheep spots on the board, I figured I could play ore with sheep, picking the 693 with my first pick. I had the 10-3-11 as my backup option, in case the game didn't go as I had anticipated. Let's have a look at how the board played out. In the end, I was pretty fortunate with the choice between the 6-5 and the 8-5 with the 3-for-1 board. I took the 6-5 because coordinated ore wheat is really strong, especially on often rolled numbers like the 6. Another reason is the 9-5-10 that is left open and the sheep board on the 6 ore. This setup only happened because my opponents made a lot of placement mistakes. For the purpose of playing ore with cheap, I think the 8-5-10 or the 6-5-11 would have been a better pick. But overall I think picking the only viable ore spot is a good idea regardless. I ended up completely dominating this game, as you can see on the screen. Let's have a look at the second game, as I believe it's much more valuable. On this second board we see a lot more ore than on the first one. We also see many wheat sheep spots and a 6-5-11 that could go really well with one of those wheat sheep spots. So it would be an option, but an ore wheat sheep player needs space. So it's less likely to be cut off by road players. That's why I think the 6-4-11 is an excellent spot to play an ore wheat sheep strategy. The 4 and the 11 are very unlikely to be blocked, but 10 points of production for a first spot is not that much. On the other hand, there are no 12-point spots on the board you're missing out on. For the second spot prediction, it's wise to look at the sand tile. The sand tile is in the second ring, which makes it so there are less free hex spots than average. So it's a good idea to look for 2 hex spots that work well with your first spot. They would be the 5-10 with the sheep board, the 5-2 with the wheat board, and either the 8-3 with the 3-for-1 board or the 8-10 with the brick board. All these combinations give at least 4 points of production for ore, wheat and sheep. As you can see on the screen, I ended up with an 8-3 with the 3-for-1 board. It's not a monster setup like the first game, but it can also get the job done. If you're looking at road placements, you probably noticed I took the safest approach every time. And because ore with sheep is such an efficient strategy, you don't need strong 3rd and 4th settlement spots. You just need space to build. For example, on the 6-4-11 I pointed my road to the right. It creates 2 potential settlement spots, while pointing to the left would have left me with only 1. A quick note, in a game I would not force myself to play an ore with sheep strategy, I would probably take the 5-9-10. But as you can see on the screen, the ore with sheep worked out fine. If we take a look at the third board, we see a lot less ore, but great wheat and sheep spots. It's kind of funny I had first position with all 3 games by the way. I see 2 ways to get the minimum of 4 points of ore production. The first is to place on the 10 ore now and to place on another ore spot later. The second option is placing on the 6-3-11 now, which is super low production. If you place on the 10 ore, you have 3 points of ore, which is not enough on its own in my opinion. So you'd need more ore and a strong wheat spot. it leaves the 6-3-11 and the 8-4-3. However, I believe it's very likely these spots are taken before you come back for your 8th settlement. So I took the 6-3-11. After some weird placements from the other players, I had a choice between the 6-9-3 and the 8-4-3, believe it or not. I decided to go with the 6-9-3 and switch it up a bit with a full or we cheap strategy. The 8-4-3 with the wheat board and the 6-11-12 still left open would have been great too. The reason I went with the 6-9-3 is that I instantly became unblockable. With 2 ore, 2 wheat and 2 sheep spots, how are opponents going to stop my development card production? The answer, they won't. One note before looking at the game results, you can see I pointed my road on the 6-3-11 to the bottom instead of to the sand tile. And the reason for this decision is how I expected the 6-11-12 to be left open with the low ore. On top of that, the 6-5 works great with the 8-4-10. Okay, let's look at how the game progressed. Orvid Sheep is really good at catching up if it falls behind, so I decided to start with some development cards. I tried to get ahead in the army race, but I got some other useful cards instead. And because I had fewer victory points than the other players, I could get some solid trades. You probably wouldn't believe it, but I ended with 2nd place in this game. The biggest reason for it is that the 6 only rolled twice during this game. And the 10 rolled 13 times. But yeah, it happens, and despite the unfortunate dice rolls, the strategy performed really well.